Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another presentation in the Barts 900 series. My name is Robert Trahan-Jones. I'm chairman of the Friends of Barts Heritage. So a warm welcome to all members of the extended Barts community, and especially warm welcome to members of the legendary Set 98, the cohort of Barts nurses who qualified exactly 50 years ago this week. They had a virtual reunion earlier this week, and I know that many of them have joined us here tonight. So congratulations, lady. That's a fantastic, fantastic achievement. Now, a few housekeeping rules before we move into our guest for this evening. We're doing a great deal of work here at Barts Heritage in these difficult times. It's good to help each other, and we are forging relationships with a number of other organizations, both within and without Barts, but with particular links to our core aims and objectives. One of those is the City Music Foundation, and at lunchtime today, we very much enjoyed their free concert given by the pianist George Fu in the Great Hall. It was a fantastic audio-visual presentation, and you'll be catching news of their future concerts in future e-shots that you received from us. And I'll bring you news of other organizations and other news from those as time goes on. Some thanks, of course. You know that these webinars are free to view, but thank you for your donations in support of our objectives. If you'd like to make a donation tonight, simply go to the Barts Heritage website, bartsheritage.org.uk, and simply click the yellow button. And it couldn't be easier. And there's the option also for including gift aid if you qualify for that. Thanks too for your thanks. A number of you have written to us to say how much you enjoy these presentations. As you know, it was one of those ad hoc things that we started to put together at the start of the pandemic. And it's been remarkably successful from our point of view, because we're increasing our audience month on month. So that really is good news. Tonight's format is going to follow the usual pattern. My guest and I will split the first 40 minutes or so in a bit of a two-way chat. And then if you want to ask any questions, then simply use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse towards the bottom of your screen, just above the toolbar, and you'll see the little speech bubble there, then pop your question in there, and we can either take the questions during Kate's presentation or we can wrap up in a Q&A at the end. By the way, I know that most of you are familiar with Zoom technology. If for whatever reason during the slideshow it transpires that the thumbnail of the speakers is obscuring some of the captions, then you can simply place your mouse on the black bar at the top of the thumbnails and drag it to another position on your screen so you can read the captions more clearly. Tonight is being recorded, as is the case with all our presentations throughout the Barts 900 series. They're all then available on our YouTube channel, and we send you the link to that recording, either in case you want to view it again or you want to recommend it to your friends and colleagues. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to introduce my guest tonight, Kate Jarman, who is the archivist for the Barts NHS Trust. Welcome, Kate. Now, I suppose in time-honoured fashion, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to a career in archiving, because of course, this wasn't your first role at Barts, was it?
No, thank you very much for having me tonight. Yeah, I've actually known Barts, oh God, I think over a decade now. And certainly archives is not what I envisaged working in as a child. I didn't know anything about archives until after I'd finished uni, really. When I was a child, I initially imagined myself as an archaeologist, and by the time I had got to A-levels, I thought I was going to be a doctor. I did biology, which then changed to philosophy at my undergrad. So clearly I really didn't have much of a clue what I wanted to do. And after university, I ended up working in fundraising for Barts charity. And while I was in that job, I did quite a lot of collaborative work with colleagues in the archives at Barts. And that's the first time I came across archive records, and I thought their job looks much more interesting than mine. This is what I want to do. So I went away, I did my training. I worked at a couple of local authority archives, and before the current role, I was at the National Archives, and I've been at the Trust now for about 7 years, where in my current role, I've got responsibility for the archive collections and both the hospital museums. There's a small team of about 3 of us, and sometimes project posts as well.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to the group of items that you've gathered together to talk about this evening. But before we do that, I've got to ask you one question, because you're not just the archivist for Barts Hospital, but for the entire Barts London group. And within your collection, as people who've seen the promotional blurb for tonight will recognise, you have the collections of 30 or so present and former hospitals from right across the district. Now, this went out on our social media. As you know, we're pretty active on Facebook and Twitter, and instantly staff and former staff and colleagues, both nursing and medical, were coming straight back onto Facebook, and we're trying to say, hang on a minute, how many of those can I name? So come on, Kate, show us the evidence. How do you make up those 30?
Well, I'm sure there are plenty of people who've worked at quite a number of them, because some of them are closed fairly recently, but I have actually got a slide listing them all as it happens. So I will pop that up now. This is the list of all the hospitals for which we hold records. Those with an asterisk are the ones which are still open. The ones in blue are those which are now part of Barts Health NHS Trust. And there, I'm sure, are names on there that will be familiar to many people here tonight. Some of them only closed in the 1980s or 1990s, and many of them were grouped until that recently with Barts and with the London. So the fact that we've got all these records is essentially a historical accident of NHS administration. It's to do with the hospital groupings as they stood, particularly in the 70s and 80s. So the 2 health districts, which were kind of linked to the London and to Barts. There was Tower Hamlets Health District and City and Hackney. There are some there which closed long before any of our attendees tonight would have been involved. So I don't think anyone worked at the invalid asylum for respectable females. But yeah, many of these were part of the groups, and when the hospitals closed, their records came to what were at the time the district archives, and have since become part of Barts Health NHS Trust archives. You'll see there's a couple of kind of outliers. There's the Royal Brompton and there's Harefield on there. So they make up, I think actually they may have just had a merger with another trust, but they until recently have been the Royal Brompton and Harefield Trust. And we have an arrangement with them where we're their place of deposit for records. So we provide their archive service. And the other one on there, which might look a bit unusual to anyone who knows where it is now, is St Mark's Hospital, which is now in Northwick Park in Harrow. It's been there since 1995, but I'm sure there will be a lot of people who remember when it was on City Road. And we have the records from the 19th century up till 1995, which is an amazing collection. And then the post-95 records are with the Northwest London Trust. So it's quite a mix. Some of these, there are very few records for, very few surviving records. Some, there are huge collections, which are still kind of to be researched in detail. We do have a map, an interactive map of showing the locations of these and some more detail about them on our website. I'll put the website address up at the end. But it's also important to remember we don't just hold hospital records. We've got the records of the associated medical schools, nursing schools, charities, the health authorities, groups and individuals associated with the hospitals. So there's a lot of stuff. It covers about 2.5 kilometres of shelving in total. And we're in the process of developing a new suite of research guides which will cover some of these areas and hopefully help people discover a bit more about the various classes of records we hold.
Well, I think we could talk all evening about these hospitals, Kate, because just looking at these names, I'm sure there's a whole chunk of our audience it is taking them right back to the day when they actually worked at these various places. you know, the Mothers Hospital. I certainly remember St. Mark's, Lenny's, the Metropolitan, etc. But let's move on, shall we? Because I know that people want to see the artifacts that you've pulled up. So, and I think you're going to take us on a chronological view through the collection using a few bullet points.
Yes, I mean it's basically chronological, but it's very much a kind of random assortment. And tonight I'm going to focus specifically on the collections of Barts Hospital itself. I can't cover all 30, let alone everything else. So I'm just going for some of the Barts records. It's been a bit of a challenge knowing where to start. We've got nearly 70,000 items listed on our catalogue, over 15,000 of which are Barts Hospital records. And there's also, like in any archive, an awful lot of uncatalogued material, which we are working on as part of our cataloguing backlog. The records span 9 centuries, from medieval deeds, which are often little more than tiny scraps of parchment, to volumes so large that they need 2 people to move them, like this one here, as well as collections of paintings, objects, and even stained glass. Now, you asked me to pick 8 or 10 interesting items tonight, and I could have picked one from every century of the hospital's existence. I could have showcase some of the most well-known documents like the Refoundation Charter or the medieval cartulary. I could have attempted to illustrate key medical developments through some of the items from the collections, but I'm afraid I'm being a little self-indulgent and I'm just going to share a few of my own favourites. It's a very brief introduction, but I hope it will give some sense of the breadth and richness of the archives and inspire everyone to find out more. The earliest document in the collections is from 1137, and it's a grant from Ray here, the founder of the hospital himself, to Hagno the clerk, the man who most likely took over from him as the second master of the hospital. Most of the pre-Reformation documents relate to the property and the property rights of the hospital because that's how it made its money. And they're a really fabulous source for London history, but they're also particularly interesting in terms of the insights they provide into the role of the medieval hospital. So this is an agreement in which Christina de Chure, widow, transfers guardianship of her sons and heirs, Ralph and John, to the hospital, along with her property near Smithfield, until her sons come of age. The 2 boys are to be educated at the hospital school and given food, clothes, shoes, and all other bodily needs. It illustrates the role of the hospital, I think, as a community of care with a much wider role than what we think of with the modern title of hospital. The hospital looked after the sick poor, but it also provided a bed for pilgrims, a home and a school for foundlings and other children, and a place of residence for many who chose to live within the hospital precinct as a place of safety and security. So I'm moving forward now, several centuries. I'm sure
just ask a question,
of course.
Kate. I dare say that previous document was written in a language that few, if any, of us could actually interpret in this day and age. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Of course, yeah. So if anyone's able to read the handwriting, they would find that this is in fact in Latin, in medieval Latin. It's that it has that in common with all the medieval documents. It was the standard language of kind of record keeping, although you do occasionally find kind of little hints of the medieval English or kind of Old English creeping in the names of people's occupations as listed in some of the grants and things. So it is a special skill to read these records, in which my medieval paleography is getting increasingly rusty with lack of access to the records. But they are all catalogued, or the majority of the medieval documents are catalogued in English on our catalogue with a kind of brief summary. And one of my predecessors as archivist did an amazing transcription of the medieval cartulary, which is a really useful kind of way into the medieval records. So there are lots of resources which can help people understand and access some of these, even if they do look a little bit forbidding.
Okay, thank you very much.
So this one is actually in English. Again, not necessarily the easiest thing to read. This dates from the 16th century, by which time many more of the documents are in English, although the spelling and the writing, as I say, is not always easy. I'm sure the audience is familiar with how the hospital was refounded with a new charter by Henry VIII after his dissolution of the religious houses, which shut down the Priory of St Bartholomew, and it confiscated the property from which the hospital made its income. The new charter, which was issued after 6 years of petitioning by the citizens of London in support of the hospital, is one of the most well-known documents in the archives. So instead I've picked this one. This, I think, gives a really fascinating glimpse into the physical spaces and daily life of the hospital at the time of the refoundation. It's a valuation of properties and possessions in London and beyond of the late monastic hospital of St Bartholomew. It was compiled in October 1546, and it was probably prepared by the Court of Augmentations, which was the government body set up to deal with the sale and administration of dissolved monastic property, for kind of evidential purposes as a precursor to the granting of the new charter the following year. It takes the form of a large roll. This is the first page of, I think, about 19, and it provides a summary valuation of the hospital's possessions. On later pages, it goes into really fabulous detail about the institution, covering fees, annuities, diet and stipends of the staff, as well as an inventory of goods arranged by room. In the section headed Stuff Remaining in the Custody of the Sisters, the inner room, called the men's room, is described as having 13 bedsteads, some barely furnished, and the inner room, called the women's room, 22 bedsteads, 9 barely furnished. It's thought that the late medieval hospital had space for 50 to 60 patients, but it's very clear from the evidence of the valuation that by the time of the refoundation, a lot of the furnishings and fittings of the hospital were in a poor state. After the refoundation, the hospital continued to grow in renown, but during the 16th and 17th centuries, it did experience its share of challenges. The minutes of the Board of Governors detail the impact of the Great Plague in 1665 and the Great Fire of London the following year, when, as an archivist, I find it particularly interesting that one of the main actions recorded by the governors was to move the records and the money off-site. There's not much mention of the patients. But what was interesting about the Great Fire is that the hospital lost a huge amount of rental properties within London, which forced them to close wards and lay off staff in the following years. So this next item is from that period. It's not actually a record created within the hospital itself, but it's a reminder that in that turbulent early modern period, medicine and healthcare were often a domestic affair, with hospitals like Barts reserved for the very sickest and poorest. It's a family recipe book, which was found behind panelling in 69 Bartholomew Close, when the bomb-damaged property was demolished in 1955 to make way for the new Queen Elizabeth II block, which I'm sure some of the audience will have worked in. The book was started in 1657 and used for about 100 years by several successive individuals, probably members of the same family, to record recipes for preparing food, as well as home remedies and medicines. So the 2 pages here show recipes. One is food, to make a pudding, to swim with butter and no butter in it, which I do quite want to try. And on the left, you've got one which is very obviously medicinal. It's for a very perfect oil against the plague and ill poison. Domestic medicine was a really huge part of medical care of the period. And I think it's really interesting to note that John Woodall, who was surgeon at Barts in the early 17th century, advocated in his 1617 book, The Surgeon's Mate, for gentle medicinal treatment rather than over-aggressive and unwarranted intervention for many ailments. So this is, I think it's really interesting in that sense. It brings the kind of the bigger picture of medicine at the time. So this document dates from the period when the medieval hospital buildings underwent what we might call a phased redevelopment to be replaced by the 4 new wings designed by James Gibbs. This is a 1757 bill for the removal of 108 tonnes of night soil from hospital properties from John Hunt nightmen and rubbish carters, and it's one of my personal favourites in the archives. I don't know if the audience is familiar with the term night soil, but the illustrations on the bill may help. They show the night soil men hard at work emptying cesspits and privies around London. Now, I have a personal, particular and very much mocked by my friends interest in the history of sanitation, but I do think it's a really important part of public health. And for me, this particular document serves as a reminder of the kind of quotidian business of running a hospital beyond the wards. The medieval hospital was linked quite early on to the common sewer, and the town ditch, but it also did rely on cesspits until quite late. And although the brick sewer system was reorganised and extended alongside the more grandiose architectural elements of the Gibbs design, we know that even after the rebuilding, there were complaints from the governors about the facilities provided to them.
Tell me then, Kate, because obviously in this day and age, we would fondly imagine, wouldn't we, that hospitals would get specialist services in respect of night soil removal and other rubbish, because of course this was the common experience before mains drainage. So is there any evidence to show that it was more effective or efficient or widespread for hospitals as compared with, I don't know, gentlemen's residences?
I think the documents suggest that it was certainly very I'm trying to think of the word. There were good systems in place fairly early on for the removal of waste from the hospital. And as I say, that the medieval hospital was connected to sewers pre-Reformation. It was, I think, a key consideration, and even long before germ theory, there was an understanding that waste needed to be removed from a place of medical care. But I don't think anyone, to be honest, has done the work on a comparison with domestic properties, but I would love to see that. So the 19th century, not long after this, saw huge medical innovation. There was new diagnostic equipment like the stethoscope early on in the 19th century, and later on towards the very end of the century, X-ray equipment. There were anaesthetics and antisepsis. And what's really interesting is that through the hospital records, you can see the changing practices at the hospital. This is an example of that. The hospital had had an apothecary on the staff since at least 1571, who prescribed medicines prepared in the hospital apothecary shop. Frederick Wood, who was appointed in 1847, was the last apothecary to the hospital, retiring in 1868 to be replaced by the new head dispenser. So this plan of equipment in the hospital's dispensary dates from the very last days of the apothecary's role. I particularly love the kind of Heath Robinson look of all this machinery, but I think what's so interesting about it is how clearly it illustrates the move from the small scale prescribing of medicines which had been hand prepared in the apothecary's workshop to this kind of semi-industrial production for huge numbers of in and out patients who were passing through the hospital doors by the mid-19th century. To give an idea of the scale, we have in the museum collections one of the mortars shown in the top left of this picture, and it's about the size of a church font. So this was a very sizable operation.
Do we know, Kate, whereabouts in the hospital of the 19th century this dispensary would have been situated?
I would have checked one of the plans. That's something I wanted to do, but unfortunately I'm mainly working from home at the minute. I did want to be able to answer that question. We do know, but I can't tell you right now, I'm afraid. But yes, a bit further down the line when we're able to access the collections more, I can certainly refer to a plan of the period.
I think all credit to you, because obviously our viewers will be familiar with the fact that the hospital and its contents are seriously off limits right now. But let's not forget that you as the archivist are also working from home, so you are not able to access those artifacts under your supervision either.
Yeah. I mean, we've been me and the team have been mainly working from home over the course of the last year. We thankfully have a lot of material which we do have digitized copies of, but there's an awful lot to which we don't have access. We're in from time to, well, I'm in mainly from time to time, because we do have kind of statutory inquiries relating to the subject access requests under the Data Protection Act and that kind of thing. But mainly we are working from home at the minute, which has been a really nice opportunity to look at what is available online and how we can increase access to the collections for people who are accessing them online like we are.
Excellent.
So moving on to the next one, this is a page from one of the hospital's external midwifery registers, which I think are a really extraordinary little series of records. Actually, one of our project archivists, Rose, who was working with us a few years ago, kind of uncovered these when she was cataloguing them. And I think they're so interesting, not just because of their clinical content, but because of the illustrations and doodles, which are found in pretty much all of the series of volumes. I think it's about 9 or 10 in total. This one is titled, if people can't see at the bottom, it's titled Listening in Utero. Of course, today Barts is a specialist hospital with a focus on cardiac and cancer care, but for much of its history it was a general hospital, including obstetric and midwifery services. The external midwifery department was established in 1849 on the recommendation of Charles West, who was the physician accoucheur and lecturer in midwifery, and later founder of Great Ormond Street. And the department remained in operation for over a century until the 1960s. It served women living within a mile of Barts and later extending further. And the service consisted of medical students acting as external midwifery or midder clerks who attended to women during labour at their own homes and for a week thereafter. The clerks were appointed for a period of a month, during which time they were relieved of other hospital duties and lived together in allocated apartments ready to attend cases. The jokes, mottos and cartoons, and this is just one example, some of them are really artistically accomplished, but I think they're a really fascinating record of a particular subculture of the hospital and its students. There's these elements of jocular competition amongst the clerks, and they're often, to be honest, fairly derogatory of the patients and their living conditions. So I think they're fascinating both in terms of the light that they shine on social and demographic histories of London in terms of the patients, but also on the kind of intersections of class and gender and medical culture in the role of the midder clerks. I thought I'd mention as a kind of interesting side note, following a discussion we had the other day, that the Archives does also hold records of home births which took place within the Tower Hamlets Health District during the latter days of this external midwifery service. And many of those home births were attended by the Nursing Sisters of St John the Divine, which is the order which inspired Call the Midwife. So we've got records of kind of that's obviously an imagined view of East London, but it is based on fact, and we have records of that period.
I think a lot of people would find it horrifying that medical students would be sent out to patients' homes to as first on call for home births. But bearing in mind the popular perception of a level of medical students' knowledge at that time.
And I think particularly that it persisted as an arrangement for quite so long. It does seem quite kind of mid 19th century. The fact that it was in place till the 1960s does seem.
Oh yes, many of our viewers will be familiar with a series of books called Round the Fountain,
Yes.
which were extracts from the Barts Journal from its foundation in the late 19th century. And I can recall, because I edited one version of that book, and I can recall one particular story, and it was called Born Before Arrival. And it chronicles the tales of those mothers who delivered before the arrival of the medical student, and then the aftermath. Yes, I can well identify with the fact that this practice occurred quite late into the 20th century.
I shall have to have a look at one of our copies of Round the Fountain, because yeah, I hadn't come across that. Thank you for alerting me to that. So moving on to the next one, we've obviously got lots of nurses in tonight, and I couldn't leave out a bit of nursing history. I hope that a lot of our audience will have had the opportunity to visit the Hospital Museum, which for nearly 25 years has told the story of the hospital's history. It's obviously closed at present, but I hope that in due course we'll be able to open again to visitors. And we find that perhaps the most kind of immediate connection for many visitors is the nursing uniforms. For both former nurses and patients, they're hugely evocative. And our collections allow us to trace the evolution of uniforms at Barts and at many of our other hospitals. This is a 1928 form which was supplied to women who'd been accepted for training, who were expected to provide their own uniforms upon commencing training. There's no version for men. Until 1957, nurses at Barts were exclusively female, and no men were accepted to train until 1979. I think Barts has both in terms of female doctors and male nurses been historically fairly late, but I think that's often a sign of a historical institution with which kind of upholds the historic trends. So the uniforms themselves and the exacting regulations surrounding them, of which this is just a small example, are a really fascinating source for histories of nursing, fashion and healthcare, not least in the rising hemlines, which you see over the first half of the 20th century. So I don't think you can tell the story of any hospital without talking about funding, which brings me on to this object from the museum collections. It's the only object I've fitted in tonight. All the rest are archives, I'm afraid, but I am an archivist. From its earliest days, securing funds to keep the hospital running has been a key concern. And as I've mentioned, for many centuries, the hospital generated its income from renting out property. But from the late 19th century onwards, fundraising events and activities became an important way to raise funds for the construction of new buildings and the upkeep of the existing fabric. This is a fortune-telling machine. So dropping in a penny in the little section at the top causes a hand on the dial to spin round, landing on a fortune prediction or piece of advice, including warnings, which I'm not sure anyone will be able to see, but there's a couple. Beware of black eyes is one of my favourite. Avoid taking chances on Tuesdays. And there's one which I think is a candidate for the motto for 2021, be patient, for good times are ahead. There's some statistics on the panel at the bottom, which again may not be clear, but they help us to date the fortune teller to around the 1930s. It reads 11,000 inpatients treated each year, nearly 500,000 outpatient visits each year. You or yours may need us someday. We help others, please help us. We think it's likely that the fortune teller was used at a fundraising event for the construction of the medical block of the King George V building, which of course has now been replaced by the amazing new King George V building. Possibly the Barts Fair of 1939, which was a very big event attended by celebrities of the day, and it featured rides and games in the hospital square. We've got some brilliant photos in the collections, as well as a television tent in the hospital square in 1939. I think it's likely this was used then, and as I say, fundraising was a really kind of huge part of the construction of many of the buildings.
Yes, I'm not sure the advice it offers is exactly evidence-based, Kate.
No, I have to say I think you'd be unwise to take some of the suggestions to heart too much. But yeah, I should probably maybe add to the catalogue a full list of them so people can see them. So fundraising, I guess, for the construction and upkeep of buildings brings us nicely to the kind of ever-evolving nature of the site and the work of Barts Heritage. As you know, Barts Heritage are raising funds to repair and restore the North Wing and the gatehouse of the hospital. And I'm sure that anyone of the audience who's worked in a hospital will know that a hospital is never finished. As soon as new buildings are complete, new clinical needs, increasing patient numbers call for new and improved facilities. So since the reconstruction of the hospital by Gibbs in the 18th century, Barts has seen fairly continual construction and reconstruction, from medical school buildings to nurses' homes to casualty and outpatient facilities. As you know, 3 of the 4 Gibbs wings survive, including the amazing North Wing, but despite the continuity of the interior of the North Wing, it's also seen its fair share of change. So for my last 2 items, I've picked a has been and a might have been in the story of the North Wing. So this is the might have been. This is a 1904 plan by Edward Blakeway Ianson, who was surveyor to the hospital like his father before him. And it shows the proposed redevelopment of the hospital into a series of pavilions. I hope that people can see the layout of the Gibbs wings in kind of dotted lines beneath the proposed new blocks. Now, of course, we know that this proposal didn't go very far, and proposed reconstructions of the hospital would, I think, be a talk in themselves. So for this last image, I think this really illustrates beautifully the theme of Barts as a place of both continuity and change. The space to the east of the North Wing is now occupied by Maggies Bart, which is a centre providing support for cancer patients and their families, and many people here tonight will remember its predecessor, the 1960s finance block. This photo shows the construction of the building that was there before that, the Moselle Sassoon X-ray therapy department, which was the first megavoltage radiotherapy unit in Europe, opened in 1936. Prior to that, sorry, did you?
No, go on.
Prior to that, there was an operating theatre in the same position, which was in a kind of lean-to glass-roofed building built in 1905 on what before that had been the hospital's Fives Court, and that's just in the last 100 years or so. So the North Wing's really witnessed a great deal of change in the last few centuries, and I guess I can kind of wrap up by saying I'm looking forward to seeing the next chapter of in the story of the building unfold, and ensuring that records of it all end up in the archives.
Just that's brilliant, Kate. Just to tease this photograph apart, because you're right that although people will have been familiar with the building that stood on this site, chiefly the finance block, I suspect, because that not a building of great architectural merit. I don't think I'm going to be chastised for saying that. But so the wall that we can see at the top of the picture there, that is the end wall of the original Gibbs North Wing.
That's right.
Which has since been exposed, and then I don't suppose many of our viewers will have seen it, but it is now within the staircase that sits between the Maggie Centre and the Great Hall. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And yeah, I mean, it actually looks a lot cleaner than it does in this photo. It was the stonework was all cleaned up during the construction of the Maggie Centre, but there's a really kind of lovely link staircase between Maggie's and the North Wing. And yes, you can see all the stonework and kind of walk up the staircase past the bricked up, or the window spaces that you can see there.
And that's Bart's the Less in the background, of course, in the top right of the shot. Well, that's a fascinating photograph, it really is. And to have that chronology starting off with the Fives Court, the operating theatre, etc., it really sort of takes us through that century.
Yeah, and you could absolutely go back further. I mean, I didn't kind of start going into the 18th, 17th century plans, but we could do a little, again, a whole presentation on just that corner of the site. And I think that's what's so great about the collections. You can kind of go anywhere you want with them, I think, really.
Well, let's take a few questions then. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask Kate a question, simply click the chat bubble at the bottom of your screen. And we can kick off with a question from William Summers, who asks, are there any references to music in the archives?
Oh, that's an interesting question. There are quite a few, mainly fairly recently, which in the scheme of the Barts archives is the last century or two. I think that the earliest and kind of in some ways one of the more interesting items is I think it's called an antiphona. That might not be the right way of saying it, but there is an item of medieval music which was actually used as in the binding of one of the volumes, which was rebound in the 19th century. I mean, it was very common in the medieval period to reuse waste from documents which were no longer wanted, and so that's the kind of earliest bit of music that we know may have been associated with the hospital, and its chants which may have been used in the priory and in the hospital chapels in the medieval period. Beyond that, we've got a lot of references and documents relating to particularly student and staff shows and clubs. So the medical school was founded in the early 19th century, and since its inception, there's been kind of student groups. I'm sure a lot of people will have been members of various student clubs and societies, and there was a tradition at Barts, as at many other hospitals, of ward shows and of performances on the wards for at different times of the year, particularly Christmas. There is one record which we have in the collections. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what period it's from. I think it's possibly the 1930s, which is a record of one of the shows, I think within the medical school. But because we don't have a record player on site, I've never actually listened to it, and I maybe should try and bring it home, but we don't. So I could listen to it here, but we don't take the collections off site. But I would love to hear it.
I was going to say that, but bearing in mind my experience of ward shows, probably most of them are not particularly amenable to a public airing. So probably it's just as well you can't lay your hands on those at the moment. Let's move to another question. Mary Hawking suggests that Charterhouse and other monasteries had a sewage system. So can you put the sewage system at Barts in the context of that? I'm trying to get the chronology right, but you will know more about that than I.
I can't off the top of my head in terms of dates. I think I'm trying to remember the earliest references that we have for some of the piped water and sewage at Barts. I think it's mainly the late 15th century, although I wouldn't want to be quoted on that. But certainly, I mean, there are plenty of references in the records. I mean, what's interesting about the pre-Reformation records is that, as I said, they are all in general property records, and so there's not the kind of detailed minutes and kind of easier to search administrative records, which you get at a later period. So the information that we have about the hospital and how it was run has to be kind of pulled out of references in different grants and charters and things. But there are certainly references to kind of rights of use of piped water, which came from Islington and that kind of thing, I think dating from the late 15th century.
Fair enough. Okay. Lara Corrison says, does the collection contain any records relating to the ambulance service? Now, I suspect that that ambulances are another service that has changed dramatically over time. Can you give us some context with that?
To be honest, I don't think there is a great deal, or certainly not that is catalogued. If there are references to, and photos of kind of, you know, the kind of ambulances which we might recognise from the kind of mid 20th century onwards, and there are references in things like some of the kind of planning minutes about the planning for a new ambulance entrance when the new casualty department was opened in 1907. That was when the gateway off Giltspur Street, which is still there, was constructed, and that was obviously designed for patients to be brought in on ambulance. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's particularly detailed records of the ambulance service per se. I think what's interesting about archives is that because they're generated to be used, they're records which are used for a function, and so how to research them often depends on kind of how they were created. If with a hospital, for example, you will often have the records of a particular department. Now, the ambulance service didn't kind of operate as a department, and therefore the references to it would be spread amongst maybe the governor's minutes, maybe, as I say, some kind of planning records and things. I'm sure there is plenty there, but I don't think it's something which anyone's done a great deal of work on. Although we'd be very, very happy to have someone come in and research that when we're able to reopen.
Okay, I think we'll put that on the waiting list then. Now, obviously, you're fielding a lot of queries from researchers, from other archivists, from a whole variety of sources. We've got one question here from Bernadette Ryan, who asks, what are the most popular collections, or the most popular, presumably, aspect of your total collection with researchers accessing your archive?
I mean, we get such a broad range of inquiries. We, you know, from academics looking at very specific kind of areas of research relating to the design of hospital buildings, for example, or medical care of sexually transmitted infections in the late 20th century, just thinking of some recent ones off the top of my head. But I think in terms of the kind of most popular inquiries, I think actually a lot of them, we obviously get a lot of people who are interested in family history, who had relatives who worked as nurses or doctors at our hospitals, and I think that's one of the most frequent inquiries that we get. I think there's a particular interest, interestingly, in the Mothers' Hospital. I think that clearly was a kind of the place of birth for a lot of people still living in East London, and so there's a lot of people interested in the kind of later 20th century records of the Mothers. It's really broad, actually. I'm not sure we could say there's a particular kind of trend of interest in a particular area. Because, as I say, there's kind of so many ways you can take the research. Obviously, at the minute, we've had a lot of we've been doing a lot of work with Barts Heritage, and the people who've been working on the Barts Heritage project on researching the North Wing itself and the history of the kind of architectural history of the hospital. And the records have a really important place in, as kind of previous webinars have alluded to, in finding out some of the kind of original decisions around paintwork and the kind of original construction of the buildings on which the decisions in the coming years will be based.
Well, as is ever the case, we're running out of time, and B, the questions really are starting to flood in now. Let's just take a couple more. Now, here's a good one. Now, this comes from Amanda McGoff, who's a member of the Executive Committee of the League of Nurses. She wants to know, are you interested in holding documents relating to nursing admissions in the 20th century? Because presumably she's got a package she would love to give you. Are you interested in receiving them?
Well, we do take donations from individuals associated with the hospital. So yes, we would absolutely be interested in hearing more. I mean, we've got records of the League, both the Barts League and the Royal London League of Nurses, as well as lots of training records from both those nursing schools and many of the others associated with the other hospitals. We also have a lot of personal material, which often does include things like training notes and certificates and things. And I think the training notes are particularly interesting in kind of illustrating the changing nursing syllabus over the course of the 20th century. So yes, we do take donations. We have a very clear collection policy. We obviously don't have room to take everything, and we don't take duplicate material, for example. But yes, please do get in touch. As you can see, I've put the contact details up here on screen. You can find our email address through the website. So do get in touch.
Well, if I could ask you to turn off your screen share now, Kate, maybe just I'll finish off with one very general question. It's unfortunate that we've run out of time, but I think I can share with everybody the fact that we have booked you for another session in the future, because obviously we've simply scratched the surface tonight, haven't we? And it's a case of our audience wanting more all the time, because the Barts archive is such a popular subject. But we all know, don't we, that the collections are locked away deep there in the basement of the North Wing. Tell us in very general terms. Obviously, as part of the restoration, Barts Heritage is doing its best to support the idea that more of the artifacts will be available on public view. Can you give us a general feel for how that might look in an ideal world from your perspective?
Well, I mean, one of the kind of interesting things we've been talking a lot with Barts Heritage about is the museum, which is a fantastic space and has been, I'm sure a lot of the audience will have visited it, but the display's been in place for nearly a quarter of a century now. And we are really excited about the opportunities that the Barts Heritage Project will give to bring some new ways of engaging with the collections into that space, whether that's kind of digital or some redisplay work. In terms of the kind of access to the collections, one of the things I'm really excited about at the minute is the planning for a new archive research space that we're doing, which will be on the Barts site in the Kenton and Lucas building, which will replace some of the facilities which we had in Prescott Street, which we moved out of last year, and that will provide some additional group space for groups to access the collections as and when, obviously, the public health situation allows that. So we're looking kind of overall as a service, not just kind of within the North Wing, but across the Barts site as a whole, about ways that we can increase access to the collections. And I think one of the things I've been really enjoying the times I have been on site recently is seeing more of the kind of clinical staff of the hospital over in the new wellbeing spaces at the North Wing, kind of just getting, who've maybe never been in the building before, and getting a kind of sense of the history of the building, and clearly getting that interest, which I think is fantastic, because, you know, particularly over the last year or so, clinical staff have been so working so hard, and it's lovely to see them kind of engaging with the hospital in a new way, and getting a desire to find out more.
And isn't that a fantastic note to finish on? So it's worth reminding our audience, if you haven't already picked up this information, a key part of the restoration of the North Wing is generating a health and well-being space for the current hospital staff. And as Kate has said, during the pandemic, we found that staff are coming in and making use of these informal spaces. And there, as we all experienced during our own Bart's story, there is that wow moment, isn't there? That kicks in the moment they set sight on the wonders within the North Wing. So that engagement with the current hospital staff has got to be a key part of our plans. So on that note, Kate, thank you so much. As I say, we've scratched the surface. We'll definitely book you with for a second session. When that might be, who knows? But there is a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, isn't there? So maybe we don't have to hold these virtual presentations for too much longer. But who knows what the future might look like, because we welcome so many more people to these webinars than we could possibly fit into the Great Hall. So maybe what's called a hybrid presentation might suit the future, where we have guests within the Great Hall, maybe enjoying a glass of wine, but we're also joined by others virtually right around the world as we are tonight. So thank you, Kate, for a fantastic presentation. Thank you, everyone, for your positive comments that continue to flood in. I can see them populating the chat screen even as I'm speaking. I can't yet confirm our March speaker. We're considering a number of topics, such as the development of Smithfield Market, the history of the Charterhouse, the history of the Priory of St. Bartholomew, which of course includes Barts the Great of the present day. So we will obviously bring you news of all these things in our next e-shot. So once again, thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And until we meet again, a very good evening. Bye-bye.